writer and journalist, and her prize award-winning book, In Search of Mary, was inspired by the life of Mary Wollstonecraft. B co-wrote the best-selling Talking About Jane Austen in Baghdad and contributed to a Virago's 50 Shades of Feminism. She has spoken at British Council literary events in Iraq, Norway, Mexico, Russia, and Palestine. And she also writes for the BBC and other media. So basically, the competition will come up on stage and we invite you to tweet for the next hour in the ZJLF mini stories. So it's hashtag ZJLF mini stories. So she will start the story, basically, and you have to finish it. And so every hour for the rest of the day, and a winning story will be posted, and there'll be a prize at the end. So everyone get your tweets in. We'd also like to thank Penguin, as it's their 30th birthday today. So if you do go past the Penguin tent, be sure to pop in and say happy birthday. But mostly, we would like to welcome on stage our guests for our very first session, which is How Bitter, the Tale of Love, Pleasure in Ottoman Istanbul. And it's going to be introduced by Vedica Kant for Cemal Kafadar. Please welcome them on stage. Thank you.
I was wondering if you can all hear me. It's a pleasure to introduce Professor Cemal Kafadar today. Professor Kafadar is the Vehbi Koç Professor of Turkish Studies at Harvard, and he works on the social and cultural history of the Middle East and Southeastern Europe in the late medieval, early modern era, and teaches courses on Ottoman history, urban space, travel, popular culture, history, and cinema. So it's a very wide area of interest. The talk he's going to give today is based on a paper he's written called How Dark is the History of the Night, How Black is the Story of Coffee, How Bitter the Tale of Love, the Changing Measure of Leisure and Pleasure in Early Medieval Istanbul. It's a very interesting paper. I've had the pleasure to read it, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of interesting questions after the talk, kind of comparing the way in which Istanbul as a city has when we talk about pleasure and leisure, the way in which it has shaped those words and our connotations of it. Before, I'll very quickly pass the floor to Professor Kafadar, but before I do, I thought it might be worthwhile to start by quoting his introductory paragraph of the essay, where he says, "One of the most significant aspects of modernity as a historical and experiential circumstance is the eagerness, or at least readiness, to manipulate one's tempo and mood through the use of various substances like herbs and concoctions, the rush to get a rush, the temptation to process a thermostat, controlling one's ups and downs. Its long and convoluted history cannot be understood without taking note of certain developments which are centered in Istanbul for some key parts of the story. Just like chocolate, cocoa, sugar, and tea, whose stories have different centers of gravity, coffee has taken an important part in the rise of modernity in the above-mentioned sense. And its story cannot be told without a deep excursion into the social and cultural life of early modern Istanbul." So we'll get, I guess, a history of early modern Istanbul, but also a history of coffee and coffee houses in the city. Later on in the essay, Professor Kafadar writes, "The emergence and spread of coffee houses in Istanbul, as well as Cairo, Aleppo, and other relevant cities, coincided with various other dynamics and processes of the early modern era, three of which are most important to underline for our purposes. New levels and forms of urbanization accompanying the rise of a bourgeoisie, the increasing use of the nighttime for socializing, entertainment, and labor as part of emerging new," and I can't see that, new something of new, well, new regimes of temporality that redefine the spheres of work and leisure, and the rise of new forms of entertainment or performative arts, primarily of the Karagoz shadow theater and Meda storytelling performances. I know that Professor Kafadar will elaborate on that, but I thought that might help set the tone for the rest of the talk, so I will pass it on to you.
Thank you very much, Vedica, for...
I think that should be working.
Okay. Do I need to hold it?
I think you need to hold
Okay. Thank you very much, Vedica, for this introduction, which in fact helps me get into the substance without saying too much, I hope, and then I will show some visuals. Okay, sorry. I need to hold it close. It's going to be difficult. Okay. I'll introduce my... Before that, I also would like to thank the organizers, of course. I'm delighted and honored to be here and very impressed with what I've seen so far at the Jaipur Literary Festival. In fact, we want to pay it what's generally considered the highest form of compliment and imitate it, if the organizers allow us, perhaps in Turkey, in Istanbul, ideally. This really is a magnificent, wonderful something. Thank you. Thank you. Now, at the center of my concerns over the course of the last few years, yes, I'll hope, yes, please keep reminding me, yeah. At the center of my concerns has been, among other things, the use of coffee as a social beverage and the invention and proliferation of coffee houses as new sites of conviviality and new patterns of sociability in the early modern period, primarily in Istanbul, but with a global perspective because similar things were happening throughout the world in very many different urban centers. I'm having too much fun without looking at to be able to speak without notes whatsoever, so please allow me if I turn to my notes once in a while. So at the center of my story has been, my concerns have been coffee and coffee houses. While mindful of Fernand Braudel's warning that the history of coffee may lead a historian astray because it often tends to put one in touch with the cute and the frivolous, and one easily forgets oneself in the attraction, in the lure of the cute, and may distance oneself from the larger questions involved. But at the same time, Braudel is quite well aware that this story of social beverages is very much a significant part of early modernity. So while aware of his warning, I did not want to give up on the possibilities offered by a close study of the diffusion of coffee and coffee houses to rethink the narrative of modernity and to rethink, if you will, the last 500 years from with a global perspective. The study itself is anchored in Istanbul, but one needs to look at different parts of the world to be able to understand what's happening in Istanbul, as well as, of course, shed light on what's happening in different urban centers by looking at Istanbul itself. Now, while engaged in this research, at first primarily for social and political, historical reasons having to do with Istanbul, I became aware, or I figured out quickly for myself, that it was closely related, not necessarily causally, but the spread of coffee houses and use of coffee, was closely related to another major transformation of the early modern period, which I call the conquest of the night, or a transformation, a gradual but unmistakable, perhaps profound transformation of the architecture of day and night, whereby one started to do all over the world, over the course of the last 500 years, more at night. And that had to create all sorts of adjustments for what I've called the architecture of day and night. I mean, you can burn the candle at both ends for only so much. Obviously, you pay for it eventually, or you make adjustments. And these are large patterns that have been happening all across the world over the course of the last half millennium. Mostly in urban centers, again, I'm speaking. These were not only new patterns of sociability and new sites of conviviality that coffee houses represented, and they are obviously one of several other types of new spatial arrangements of social life. I'll show you some pictures, and coffee houses come from out of the blue and are strikingly innovative, at least when they arise in the 16th and 17th centuries, but they are part of a larger scene of changes in similar ways, and they have to do with increasing uses of the nighttime, as I said, but also changing regimes of work and leisure. And new types of entertainment, such as those that Vedica mentioned, the Karagöz shadow puppet theater, which was the rage in coffee houses and elsewhere, including private home and garden settings throughout the Balkans and the Middle East and some other parts of the world in this early modern, until the age of cinema, actually. And there's a brief bit of overlap in the late 19th, early 20th century between cinema and Karagöz, which is a fascinating story in its own right. Along with Karagöz, there was another new form of literature, public literature, if you will, because it was based mostly on performativity and oral renditions of urban tales in social settings, like coffee houses, and these are the meddah stories, which are based on medieval precedents, but with new, modern, so to speak, namely of-the-day types of stories of things, affairs, interesting, newsworthy things that were happening contemporaneously, and stories were told in different social settings about those by meddahs, raconteurs. Now, if this is an important story of modernity, if this is an important part of modernity, what I find very striking, and one reshuffles one's priorities of messages, if you will, or exploratory venues as one studies over the course of several years on a project. And lately it's dawned more and more on me that there is something in this story that I didn't highlight enough in the beginning. Now, the story of coffee begins in Yemen. The use of coffee as a social beverage, and the use of coffee for a certain nimbleness of the mind, as they put it, at nighttime for one's vigils and symposia and mystical exercises, namely to keep oneself awake throughout the night. So you have Sufis from Yemen who really initiate this big thing, and then you have two merchants from Syria, from Aleppo and Damascus. And when I mention these words these days, these places, my heart sinks. But at least we can pay tribute to them in rethinking the story of modernity by recognizing the creativity of these places, which are often not part of stories that are based in different geographies for many good reasons, perhaps, but do not recognize the worldwide, the global nature of what was happening in the 16th and 17th century. So we have the Sufis from Yemen, who start the conquest of the night, followed very closely by Palestinian Jews, I don't know what else to call them, who practiced the Lurianic, neo-Kabbalistic form of mysticism that emerged in the late 16th century in the age of coffee and coffee houses in the countryside near Jerusalem, and they were some of the very first to take coffee to Europe. Again, mostly for their nightly vigils, but eventually it spread into social uses in cafes, coffee houses. So you have Sufis from Yemen, again, merchants from Syria, Palestinian Jews, And shadow puppet theater itself came to the Middle East, first to Cairo and then to Istanbul and other urban centers from the Indian Ocean. And of the new types of literature, there was a new genre of poetry called city thrillers. But these are thrillers in the sense of those who thrill one, namely those who throb one's heart, if you allow me. The beauties of the city, male and female, were written about in these city thrillers, and that genre itself was born in Tabriz and came from Tabriz. So you have a very different geography if you take my story of rethinking modernity, at least a bit seriously, and that geography would give us a very different kind of perspective on what was happening in the so-called early modern era. Now, I will say a few more words at the end, but now I can turn to my visuals very quickly. And this is the full title. Do you see something? Good. This is the full title of the paper and the continuing project. Namely, not the title itself is not so important, but the important thing is that it really brings together, in the ways I tried to indicate very briefly, sites of sociability like coffee houses with a new temporal regime that has to do with the nighttime, with forms of public entertainment and new types of literature. Those three elements in the title are the things that I try to bring together, weave together in this new narrative. Okay, next slide, please. This is the earliest picture we have of a coffee house. This is circa 1600 in a manuscript that is now in Dublin. And I'll talk more about that, but let's keep that picture in mind. I'll show it to you again. Next, please. Now this one is from Mussolini's Italy, fascist Italy, proudly proclaiming that it has now invented the espresso machine. Of course, compared to the fancy new machines, this looks amazingly dated, I'm sure, and perhaps gives you a sense of nostalgia even. But this, in the 1930s, was what Italy wanted to proudly claim as its place in the vanguard of modernity, because it was also made out of aluminum, one of the very important substance of industrial modernity. Here you have coffee, aluminum, and a machine, though for our day, the machine itself may look primitive, put together as Italy's proud claim to having a good place in modernity, in the world, in the modern world. We take it for granted now. That kind of image is very understandable to us, and that is what I want to present by way of an ironical turn of discoveries for me when I figured that what we take for granted as the pace setter for modernity, one of the pace setters for modernity, coffee, or caffeine-like substances that we take for granted in giving us what we call is definitely not a medieval, a modern tempo. All of that really goes back to those Sufis in Yemen and the neo-Kabbalistic Jews in Safed, etc., etc., etc. Now, for instance, wherever you travel in the world, in any major urban center, and even in lesser ones, you probably take it for granted that there will be a coffee house. 500 years ago, there was nothing like it. Tavern is a very different kind of establishment. Let's continue with the slides, please. This reminder of the 20th century take on coffee and how different it looks to us from the 16th century, but actually it is a continuous narrative in a very important sense. Next is, yes, the early modern of coffee from the modern 20th century. This is a late 17th century book. This is the frontispiece of a book about coffee, tea, and chocolate. For the sake of brevity, I'm speaking only of coffee, but actually social beverages were many. And these were the three big ones in the early modern period. Coffee, tea, and chocolate, represented by a Turk, is it? Yes. By a Chinaman, according to the book, and an Indian, meaning an American, a Native American, who is associated with chocolate, of course. And this, the book claims, this book was written originally in French. I have the frontispiece of a German translation for you. Went through many different translations into different European languages and many different editions, because in the late 17th century in Europe, it struck people as odd, as new, as interesting, as fascinating, that all over the world right now, unlike before, you could go somewhere and have a hot beverage in a social setting. In that sense, coffee and its friends, its companions, had conquered the world by the late 17th century, with some exaggeration, of course, but that's what the book claims, and there is something to it. Next, please. It's that little plant from Yemen that started it all, and botanical treatises were written both in the Ottoman world, in Arabic and in Turkish, and in Europe, in different European languages, in the 17th century to understand coffee. Like there were, of course, treatises based on older Chinese texts, maybe on tea. Next, please. Back to our coffee house. Just give you some vignettes of that new site of sociability that I keep referring to. And let me see. At the lower end of the picture, you see people with books in their hands, if you look closely. These were books of poetry often. That's where poetry really flourished. And poetry competitions. I'm sorry to have to stand up to see more of this. Next, please. See more details. Next. Next. Backgammon, chess, and other kinds of games were introduced into these settings. Next. 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 One other thing, those with books in their hands, if you look closely at their turbans, they have you see some red spots? Those are roses and carnations, which we know that were tucked in their turbans. There was a certain new kind of fashionableness and elegance associated with this new setting, obviously. Next. Next, please. This has nothing directly to do with the coffee, but in 1582 in Istanbul, there was a big guild parade in honor of the circumcision of one of the princes. There were 60 days of celebrations in the city, in the ancient hippodrome area, where you see this scene set. And here you see the Guild of Florists parading and displaying their wares. That's just to give you the context, the spatial context of the next picture. And at the tribunes, if you know what I mean, among the audience, but not the public standing, rather in those seats, you see dignitaries from different parts of the world, including Europeans and from different Muslim countries, observing these events. So the next picture in 1582 was a great innovation for many of them from any part of the world. Next, please. In that setting, also the coffee house owners paraded. And this is a full human-size rendition. They walked, really, they pushed this huge thing on carts. Real human beings were inside it, reciting poetry, drinking coffee, and as they pushed, poor apprentices, of course, they had to push this cart like the florists you saw before, parading in front of the dignitaries and the public. Next, please. 1582, there was already a guild of coffee house owners. 1600 is that other picture I showed you, is the earliest picture. In the 1550s, 2 Syrian merchants introduced the coffee house as we now know it for the first time in the city of Istanbul, because it was so populous. They were coffee merchants, and to them it made very good sense to market their ware. But what a brilliant entrepreneurial idea that now we take for granted, as I said. You go to a city and you say, where's the coffee house? Next, please. This is another brilliant entrepreneurial ingenuity. And here in Cairo, you see the Nile in the middle, a coffee house spreading across the two aisles, across the two banks of the Nile. We have written evidence also for this particular coffee house. And the boats could, like drive-ins, come through the coffee house, get their coffee, and they could row down the Nile. And we also know that with those coffee cups, they played flirtatious games. So if you saw somebody you liked on a boat nearby, you would send the coffee cup in that direction. And if they picked it up, they were interested. That's what I mean, new patterns of sociability, new sites of conviviality. It's really much more than space in the generic abstract sense. It's full of people doing things, new things with them. Next. A coffee house, the first picture we have of a European coffee house, this is from circa 1650, London. The first coffee house, registered coffee house in Europe is in Oxford, a university town. That should not surprise you, those of you in Jaipur. In 1648, soon thereafter, a London coffee house was established, while private environments were already consuming coffee in homes or in those mystical circles that I mentioned of the Palestinian Jews traveling to Europe, etc. And here, too, you see a homosocial space of men only. For a long while, until the 19th century, more or less, both in Europe and the Middle East and elsewhere in the fringes of this geography, coffee houses were mostly male spaces. But women did, of course, enjoy coffee just as much. Next. This is from Amsterdam. Next, please. Back to our picture now. In Europe, there's the realization that coffee houses and tea houses and the like are everywhere in the world. And chocolate houses, mostly in Spain, Iberia, because of their, of course, American connection. Next. One of those more handsome kinds of coffee houses that were built in the 18th century with an eye to vistas. That was another important element of coffee house culture, to turn to beautiful views, to make the best use of vistas. Next, this one is the obvious case of the coffee house turned to vistas. Here in Istanbul, it's looking at the famous skyline, beginning with this Topkapı Palace that you see in the background, but at the end of the picture, moving toward the minarets and domes to come. Next. This is a much more humble coffee house at the port area, but again, making use of vistas, turning itself toward city views. By then, Istanbul skyline was getting a worldwide fame, and people were producing Istanbul-like cityscapes on walls or different decorative elements in their homes, mostly in the Ottoman world, but way beyond Istanbul itself. And here for this coffee house, which is visited by sailors and the people of the neighborhood, we hear that it was visited regularly by Muslims and Greeks and Armenians and Jews and Italians and all sorts of other people. Next, please. Women. A famous scene from a bathhouse. Lady Montagu, the wife of the British ambassador in the early 18th century, and a great author herself, one of the Blue Stockings. Lady Montagu, in her memoirs, wrote that, well, women don't go to the coffee houses, but they do have their coffee houses, and those are the bathhouses where they go for socializing for hours, for poetry and music, similar, actually, engagements, for city gossip, as in coffee houses, for politics, as in coffee houses. And this is a scene from the 18th century of a socially vibrant kind of bathhouse scene. Next. Here from the 17th century is a private party of elite women in some home, in some small palace. And if you look closely again, while they enjoy the music and conversation, and the dancing, they hold small cups, coffee cups in their hands. Next, please. Coffee was, one should not think of it only as a social beverage. Coffee and tobacco joined the scene in Istanbul and in the Ottoman environment as an import by the English, import into the Eastern Mediterranean circa 1600, so about 50 years after the coffee houses. And it was, but the two were also enjoyed in private settings very much. Especially you have, I couldn't find one for today, but you have husband and wife scenes, or two lovers, man-woman scenes with coffee pot boiling and with chibuks, long pipes for smoking tobacco. And a witty Arab poet at the time wrote one of the greatest one-liners ever about coffee. It's a bit off the cuff, but I'll have to cite it. It's one of the very best ever. And he said, "Ad-duhan bila kahwa, kal-jima bila shahwa." Tobacco without coffee is like sex without lust. The rhyme is beautiful in Arabic. Kahwa, shahwa. Next, please. Social scene of bathhouses. Here you see men. Next, please. I'll give you very briefly scenes from different kinds of places where socializing and conviviality could take place among genders, of course, but also among people of different ethno-religious backgrounds to the degree that these were possible. Marketplaces, next. Shopping malls, so to speak, namely bazaars, covered bazaars and open bazaars. Next. Piazzas in front of fountains, men, women, and people of different faiths of the neighborhood. Next, please. Public transportation. Istanbul being a city of waterways, it was mostly traversed by public transportation, shared cab system, so to speak, but on boats, shared boats, men, women, sometimes this is all women. Next. This is a mixed one where you see men, women, Muslims, non-Muslims. Next. 17th century pictures. Picnics, promenades. Next, please. Next, please. Same picture. Next, please. Heated political debates in coffee houses. Next, please. Coffee houses, as I said, coffee itself moved from the Sufis of Yemen circa 1400 to Cairo circa 1500. We know coffee was being consumed in homes and there were coffee stalls, and to Istanbul circa 1550 with coffee houses as we know them. Around the same time, as I said, there were new uses of the nighttime. And this is the first picture of nighttime decorations that were considered an invention, and according to the very orthodox Muslims, a dubious innovation even, though by now everyone is accustomed to it, namely, especially during the month of Ramadan, but also during other holy nights, decorating the space between minarets with candlelight or with oil lamps. Eventually, they started writing texts with this. Eventually, they started making figural decorations with this, though this picture itself does not give you that kind of decorative richness. It is the very first picture we have, circa 1570, and at the same time, we start hearing of the uses of coffee houses at nighttime for entertainment and of other spaces at nighttime, and the authorities are getting concerned. Next, please. Next, please. A brothel scene, but let's, for the sake of time, different kinds of uses of things that appear in our sources more and more frequently at nighttime. Places like taverns were also frequented, and authorities were concerned because people were going out a lot. Even Muslims were visiting taverns in growing numbers, and there were lots of edicts against this. Next, please. Also, those kinds of festivities that I showed you were happening at the Hippodrome. This also is a circumcision festivity, but from 1720, and in this instance, more happened at night than during the day, whereas in 1582, almost all of it had happened during daytime. This is from 1722. On the Golden Horn of Istanbul, if you know the city, public entertainers and acrobats are making their shows. Next, please. More of the same. The Golden Horn, nighttime entertainment, fireworks, and many other things we read about. Next, please. And another kind of night nocturnal activity, which was not unheard of, but was now becoming more common. Sufi houses, Sufi orders and Sufi lodges. This is one of the famous ones of the Mevleviye, the whirling dervishes in the Pera quarter of Istanbul. Again, see how, like the coffee houses, like kiosks, it turns itself to beautiful views and vistas. It is clearly trying to make use of cityscapes while the ritual is going on. And these kinds of rituals became spectacles so that foreign visitors to the city, but definitely city folk themselves, could come and visit as spectators, not necessarily as Sufis themselves or as part of the ritual. And more, beginning in the 18th century, more and more Sufi orders adopted this practice of accepting spectators, accepting people to. Of course, there was a proselytizing kind of dimension to it, perhaps, but for many people, it was enjoyment of music and poetry and the show itself with a different secular perspective, you might call it. And eventually, in the late 19th century, in Baedeker's types of guides to Istanbul, you do have, like now we are used to seeing theater guides and movie guides, you do have guides to nightly vigils of the different Sufi orders. So if it's Thursday night, you can go to this, that, and the other in those neighborhoods. Address is given. And if it's Friday night, you can go that, and the other one in those other neighborhoods. And again, you are given the address. They become a regular part of the evening life of the city. Next, please. Okay. Now I can conclude, maybe. So coffee houses and these new types of conviviality. I was just making myself comfortable. Coffee houses and new types of conviviality around social beverages offered new pleasures, of course, but like all thrills, new anxieties and tensions as well. New regimes of work and leisure meant reordering social time and division of labor among men and women. In 1675, a petition was posted all over London, which is called, some of you may have seen this, Women's Petition Against Coffee. That enfeebling liquor. Now, that enfeebling liquor was used here in two senses. One, in Galenic medicine, too much coffee is bad for men because men have a dry temperament and coffee is a drying substance. Too much coffee may imply loss of masculinity, whereas women with a wet temperament can have as much coffee as they wish. That's why in the coffee cantata of Bach, if you remember, he's rarely humorous. I love, Bach is magnificent always, but not always humorous. But his coffee cantata is a comedic piece of great wonder. And in it, you have a young woman who loves coffee, and she wants her father to find her a husband who will allow her to drink as much coffee as she wishes, because it's good for her, she argues. Anyway, the rest of the story you can follow and listen to the great music too. Now, that enfeebling liquor is a reference to that clearly, but also the rest of the vocabulary implies that it took men away from the social spaces which they frequently inhabited probably a bit more together. In other words, in terms of division of labor, in terms of social time, men spent more time homosocially. At least so the writers of the petition argued. So reordering of social time and division of labor among men and women, organization of labor, of course. The conquest of the nights may sound fascinating, and at first I had very many romantic notions of it, but in 1870, in the Paris Commune, one of the top demands of the revolutionaries, was that nighttime labor be abandoned, it be eliminated. Namely, of course, labor too moved into the nighttime, especially with gas lamps and electricity. And it is very unevenly shared, this resource that we take for granted. And I'll give you one night of full lighting in the Dallas Cowboys stadium complex, not just a stadium, it's a huge entertainment complex. One night of lighting there is equal to the annual electricity consumption of the country of Gabon. So the conquest of the nighttime itself is a very unevenly distributed event, process, that we need to note these things and different kinds of implications. Obviously, in terms of the anxieties and tensions that they generated, coffee and uses of nighttime, are political uses of coffee houses. I did not mention it's the better known part because coffee houses both in the Ottoman world and in Europe and their counterparts in different parts of the world were banned, sometimes frequently, depending on contexts. But it's not just because they led to mobilization and to rebellious gatherings. Even the normal peaceful types of activity in coffee houses sometimes caused concern among authorities because they led to unusual encounters among different ethno-religious communities. So nighttime, good music. A coffee house is known for a great kind of shadow puppet theater performer, Karagöz performer, and Greeks and Muslims and Jews all go hang out there. And for the very orthodox of any of these religious communities, these could be matters of concern. So for instance, the rabbi were giving responsa in which they said, it's okay to the coffee house, but you should not accept coffee from the hand of an unbeliever. Those kinds of dietary concerns, for instance, were among, or in, again, the coffee houses of Safed, already in the 1580s, they were singing songs in Turkish. This bothered some of the authorities, so they commissioned the rewriting of those same songs in Hebrew or Ladino. And a book was printed of these texts in the 1580s already, because there was printing. Printing was much later in the Arabic script in the 1720s, but there was printing among the Jews of the Ottoman world already starting in the mid-16th century. And they printed, one of the first printed books has to do with songs one sang in unison at coffee houses, and they had, of course, all kinds of secular love themes, etc., etc. Revolts, I mentioned, nighttime entertainments, and now I just want to read to you two paragraphs, if I can open this, which to me has been the most, whoops. I have to get used to this. Full page, how do I do full page? Yes, beautiful. I mentioned the changing architecture of day and night and how it has to do with nighttime entertainments and the new scene created by institutions like coffee houses, or more uses of bathhouses for these reasons, not only by women, but also men. We know, socialized for hours in bathhouses. This is not a new institution like coffee houses, but compared to what there was before the 16th century, the number of bathhouses proliferated per population tremendously. Oh, okay. We should 15 minutes. Okay. I'll just read you this. But playing with the architecture of the nighttime naturally meant adjustments for the morning as well, as those who were tempted to burn the candle at both ends quickly found out. Sometime before 1581, a professor at one of Bursa's respected madrasas, colleges, saw himself in a dream, crying his heart out while making preparations for his father's burial. Upon awakening in a state of trepidation, he knew he needed a reliable dream analyst and was led by friends to a renowned Sufi. The saintly man knew exactly why the young scholar had been visited by that disturbing dream. He must have missed the morning prayer, for that is the most powerful of all the ritual prayers. Now, the hagiographer who wrote the hagiography of the saintly dream analyst, who related this anecdote, happened to be the guilt-ridden dreamer's son, for whom the interface between one's faith and filial piety must have served as an additional lesson. He was in a good position to know, he was in a good position to not only certify the truthfulness of the Sufi's interpretation, that he must have missed the morning prayer, that's why he saw his father dead. He was not in a good position to only certify the truthfulness, but also offer his father's explanation for the slip. He had been to a show on the night before in a coffee house and could not wake up in the morning, so he missed the morning prayer. A new time, new concerns, new anxieties. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Kafadar. I'll open it up to questions and answers, but I'll take the opportunity to perhaps ask you the first one. I think when I was asked to moderate the panel, I was, of course, very excited. And I read your paper and thought, well, I knew what to expect because I had worked a bit on the Ottoman Empire and the Turkish Republic. But I thought that might be a bit obscure for an audience in Jaipur. And then, of course, on the 1st of January this year, we saw the attack on the nightclub in Istanbul. And one of the things you talk about in your paper briefly is not just about coffee houses, but other spaces that did change the distinction between day and night. So spaces like the taverns, the meyhanes that you mentioned, and bozahanes, places where you could drink boza. And it seems like that last paragraph you quoted, that kind of almost concern about the ways in which these spaces of modernity and temporality are kind of making us less moral still applies today. And I was just wondering if you could comment on that a bit more.
Thank you. What a good question, and a sad one too. I mean, of course, makes one think. We came to India just a couple of days after, and our heart was so heavy. Our heart was so heavy those days. The last 2 weeks helped us a lot in just immersing ourselves in wonderful travel and seeing sights and things. Yes, but kind of process and the ultimate phenomena that emerge with it over the course of the last 500 years have tended to bring us to a moment when big cities, vibrant, full of socializing at night, and different kinds of social venues become primary targets at the same time for those who want to go to the heart and soul of political society, of society in general, of course, but I mean their primary goal is, at this particular kind of instance, pitched at the political level, among others. This is yet another aspect of the conquest of the night, for instance, that one has to consider as a non-romanticizable but real phenomenon to reckon with. Yes. Let me leave it with that. Please, you handle.
I was very intrigued by the enfeebling petition. Nabil Matar, in his book on Islam in early Europe, talks about coffee houses as being regarded as places, slightly lascivious places, partly because of the association with Turkey, which the British thought of as a very sexy place, and partly also because coffee was considered in Jacobean England an aphrodisiac. How do the two go together? I mean, there seems to be a contradiction.
Yes, good question. Of course, I mean, we're talking of the 17th century now, and Galenic medicine is not, especially, second half of the 17th century, it does not have the same kind of monopoly over medical notions as it did. Among the authors, I don't know. With these new substances in particular, tomato too was very perplexing. I mean, even if you take Galenic medicine and its ordering of substances quite seriously, coffee and tomato and the like were new. It was very hard to place them in that very same scheme of things as comfortably, as confidently as before. With tomato, until the 19th century, people were quite wary of producing it, of consuming it widely. In the 18th, it was beginning to get popular, but in the 19th, it really acquired all this later popularity, because for a long while, people had doubts about tomato, while some did consume it, the venturers. Yes.
So many questions.
Yes.
I think we'll start here, the gentleman, and then we'll go. There was a question there, and then we'll come back here.
Sorry. Hello. What an amazing story in history. My compliments. I'm also. I'm curious that giving us the denouement or the metaphor of changing the social architecture from daytime to nighttime, I'm curious you did not mention anything about the element of caffeine in coffee, which keeps people awake. And I'm also equally curious why after a meal one tends to have coffee and stay awake when you should be sleeping at that time.
Yes. Coffee was also considered a digestive. Among various different notions of its impact on the body, this was one, and that's why in fact, the first European observers of coffee were writing about coffee before they had any experience with it themselves. At least it was not yet spread in Europe, and they were just having one maybe sip and then writing about it. And they said this is consumed a lot because people consider it's very good for the stomach after a meal. But of course, the relationship with its property to keep one awake also had to do with the new enjoyment people write about of nighttime conversations and nighttime entertainments and the like. I recently organized a small workshop on the history of the nighttime with colleagues who work on different parts of the world, and I had Sanjay Subrahmanyam speak about South Asia in the 17th century in the nighttime, and he spoke of a nighttime diary of, I believe it was Shah Jahan, and there was nothing like it before. Namely, a courtier kept a diary-like source for whatever was happening at nighttime. Because, first of all, obviously in South Asia and in Egypt, given the climate, more happened at night, even before what I've called the conquest of the night. I have not been able to develop all of these different comparative angles, but still, after the 16th century, there was more even in those places where there had been a lot happening, like Egypt, like South Asia, where the climate and various other things allowed for nighttime uses. Sorry, I went into a slightly different end, but I think it is related to your question, I hope.
I think there was a question here.
Thank you, sir, for such a fascinating story of a food item which gives wings to imagination in history. The question I'm going to ask is a little mundane one. I want to know the social status of coffee as a social beverage in modern Turkey. Why I'm asking this is because my exposure to Istanbul is through two sources, Pamuk and some of the TV serials that we've been seeing. In none of them, coffee is emphasized. In fact, in the TV serials, people are having far too much of tea. And, is it a class thing? Is coffee a elite? Because the characters in the TV serial are very common people. Okay, so I really want to know that.
Yes.
That is number one. Okay.
Okay, well, thank you. In the late 19th century, Ottoman intellectuals start writing of coffee houses as places for the idle, places. It becomes a déclassé institution in the late 19th, early 20th century, when you have either European-type cafes or other venues for socializing that people try to create. So first of all, as a social institution, it acquires this déclassé air, and until recently, it had much of it during my childhood and youth. But lately, you have these European or American chains, and that brings young and hip folks, men and women, together in a new use of coffee houses. But in terms of coffee versus tea, that's related but slightly different story. In the 1930s, the young Republic of Turkey sent some agricultural engineers to India, Assam, to Japan, to various places to study how one could grow tea in Turkey. And they were successful. By the late 1930s, in the northern Black Sea region close to Georgia and Armenia in Turkey, they started producing tea, and it's so successful, tea prices are far better than coffee prices, especially after the late 1970s, when Turkey had a big currency crisis, couldn't import coffee for a couple of years, barely, and then people switched to tea big time, and now tea has conquered. I'm sort of sad about this. I like tea very much, but when I go someplace and they don't even have coffee, I say, oh, please. Okay.
Unfortunately, that's all we have time for. So I think if you have questions, you have to catch
Kamal, I don't know about you guys, but I definitely feel in the mood for a coffee. Now, Kamal will be at a book signing on our left-hand side between Durbar Hall and Batak. So if you have any other questions, please head over there. Feel free to grab a signature. You can purchase his book or a pre-signed book at the bookshop. We'd also like to thank... Yeah, it's fine. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. Kamal will be available, to sign his book, and we also have tickets.